We start this morning, do we, with Tony and Monica?
Yes, sir.
Tony and Monica, please.
Please state your full name.
Monica Marie Summers.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Please state your full name.
Michael Anthony Summers.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Monica and Tony, you're here to talk about Paul. Paul was yours and your wife Patricia's son,
Yes.
and your husband, Monica. And Paul's sister Bethan is here with you to provide you with support whilst you give evidence. We're going to put up 3 photos of Paul during the course of the evidence. And we're going to start with one particular photo, and it'll stay on screen for the first part of the evidence. Thank you. So, Paul was born, Tony, in 1964
Yes.
and diagnosed with haemophilia A when he was about 5 years old.
Yes.
There's no family history of haemophilia.
None whatsoever.
And so how did it come to be diagnosed?
He was frequently in hospital in Bridgend with bumps and bruises and difficulty in walking on occasions, and that was over a period of about 2.5 years. And then a visiting doctor asked why he was still on the same adult ward every time he went there, sent for more blood tests, and about a few days later we were asked to meet at the hospital and go by ambulance with Paul to the Royal Infirmary in Cardiff. We were told he had been diagnosed with haemophilia. We met Dr. Bloom at the Royal Infirmary, and he told us what Paul's life would be like and how the treatment would take place.
Initially, it would seem from the documentation and from your statements that Paul's haemophilia was categorised as being moderate.
Yes, yeah.
Although he required treatment on a number of occasions during his childhood and teenage years, he led a very active, sporty life.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. He played football, cricket, he loved being active. He even went on a skiing holiday. Of the 4 people in his room, he was the only one who didn't need an ambulance at the airport coming back.
And you've got a memory of going to collect him, seeing the ambulance.
Seeing the ambulance pulling out to the plane at Cardiff Airport and thinking, oh, no, not to hospital. In fact, it wasn't Paul at all, it was the others.
Now, it was when Paul was about 14 or 15 years old, he began to receive home treatment.
Yes.
In about the late 1970s.
Yep.
Prior to that, had he largely received cryoprecipitate?
Yes, he had some, yes, yeah.
And then he started to receive factor VIII products, and he would inject himself, or you and your wife would at home.
That's correct.
Can you recall what discussions there were with you about the change from cryoprecipitate to factor VIII?
Yeah, we were told that this was the way forward to help people like Paul, then he would not need to be coming into hospital so often, and therefore not miss any schooling. It was a great step forward for young boys, and an odd statement also at the time, and it was cost effective. I thought it was an odd statement at the time. Being in business, I understood cost effective, but it was unusual to hear a doctor say it, that this would be the way forward. And to a degree, it was. It was good.
Did Professor Bloom or anybody else at the hospital give you and your wife, or Paul himself, any warnings or advice or information about any risks of infection associated with the use of the products?
Nothing.
We're just going to have a look at some of the documents to see what treatment Paul was receiving and when. Paul, could we have up on screen, please, 2406002? And we can see there, we see there a list of treatments and the reason for them. Picking it up in 1979 onwards, we've got, first of all, 16th of May 1979, bed rest and cryoprecipitate. But then we see Paul receiving, on a prophylactic basis, 3 times a week, factor 8.
Yes.
And that continuing in the course of 1979, and then in 1980, twice weekly prophylactically, through to the end of 1980.
Right.
And then if we have up on screen, please, 2406003. We've got a letter here from Professor Bloom dated the 13th of June 1979. And we can see that here the reference to, it's a letter to the GP, but to Paul being on prophylactic injections of anti-haemophiliac factor 500 units 3 times a week for the past couple of weeks. And then we see in the second paragraph, Professor Bloom informing the GP of the home treatment regime, and Paul now keeping a supply of the factor in his fridge at home. Now, if we look halfway down that paragraph, we can see Professor Bloom telling the GP that the concentrate is a highly purified preparation of factor 8 from normal human plasma and very rarely gives rise to reaction, and then it talks about what you might do in the case of allergic reaction. No reference there to any more significant risks
No.
of infection. At the time that Paul changed from having his treatment in hospital to home treatment, was there at that stage any discussion with you about any risks?
No.
And then, if we could have up on screen, please, Paul, 2560007. Right, I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. We'll come back to that document. If we have up on screen, please, 2406004. We can see there a further letter from the hospital, not this time authored by Professor Bloom, referring again to, if we can have the first main paragraph of the letter, please, thank you. Referring in the last part of that paragraph in 1982 to Paul's haemophilia being well controlled. He last required factor 8 injection for a cut on his hand, and he's not bled into the joints for 3 or more years. In the early 1980s, at the time with which this letter is concerned, what can you recall about the extent to which Paul needed to have treatment?
The things had improved as far as the treatment and helping him to get about and pursue his education. But Paul was finding it more and more difficult at times to cope with it. And I just felt we had very little communication with the hospital to tell us. And yet already we were seeing letters in the media and about the possibility that blood was a problem. But whenever I asked at the hospital, they said, no, there's nothing, it's fine.
Then if we can have up on screen, please, 2406005. This is a letter, May 1983, so we're 1 year further on, and we can see here in the second paragraph, and it says Paul's had quite a good year, no admissions to hospital over this time, He's only had 3 bleeds in the last year, receiving 2,000 units of factor VIII on each occasion at the Bristol Royal Infirmary. Paul was being treated at this time partly at Bristol because he was studying there.
Yes, yes, he was in Bristol College studying civil engineering.
Now, he was obviously by that time a young man.
Yeah.
And attending appointments without you.
Yes.
But as far as you can recall from any of the subsequent discussions you had with him, was he given at that hospital any information or advice or warnings about
No,
this?
it was just regarded as a routine. If he had a bleed, he went to the hospital. And as it states, he had a fairly good period at that time, in that first year in Bristol. And we didn't have the same, well, we had concerns, but not as deeply. It seemed everything seemed to be under control.
Now, Paul didn't complete his studies at Bristol. He decided civil engineering was not for him.
Yes.
And if we have up on screen, please, 2406006, we can see that Paul here in September 1984, he's back in Cardiff under the care of Professor Bloom. We can see in the first paragraph reference to being given a dose of factor VIII concentrate, and this being the only dose of factor VIII that he's had in the last 20 months. There's no reference in this letter addressed to the GP to any issues about risks of infection in September of 1984. Again, was anything said to Paul when he came back under the care of Professor Bloom in 1984 about risks?
No.
And then could we have up on screen, please, 2406007. Now, this is an extract from the clinical notes relating to Paul, and there's an entry dated the 14th of April 1983. It starts with quite a good year. And then if we just go down a little bit further, please, with the document, we can see something's been redacted halfway down the page. We could just have that line highlighted.
Yes.
Patient has had same batch number as, and then something's redacted. Tony, could you tell us how you came to receive this document?
For many years, I've been asking the University Hospital, could we have sight of Paul's records? And they were either, we were told they were not available, they'd been destroyed, or they were in a warehouse somewhere in Treforest and just not available. And it was a brush off each time. And then last September, our chair of the Haemophilia Society phoned me and said, Paul's records are available, and if you go to the University Hospital this week, you can pick them up. And that's the first sight we had of any of his records for all the years he was back and forth to hospital was last September.
And the page that you were given, of which this is a copy, had a post-it on, which a nurse had written something on. What was that?
Well, the nurse had highlighted all the pages that we needed to consider and look and read, and this one in particular, because, you know, in that time, it was obviously known by them that Paul was HIV, but we didn't know, and he didn't know. But yet he was receiving blood, the same batch of somebody who possibly had died. Don't know who that person was because, as you see, he's been blanked out completely. And that makes you more angry that the information was hidden from us for all those years. Reaction, not surprised, not totally shocked, is what we expected to see, but the fact that they'd kept these records from us for such a long time, it wouldn't have made any difference, but it would have helped us to understand what he was going through at that time. Had we known that as far back as 1980 they were testing him for AIDS at 16 years of age, and he was a minor, but nobody consulted us on that. We never knew that he was being tested, and that's only been discovered recently as well.
And in relation to this particular document, the copy that was given to you has this redaction, but the nurse who gave it to you has put on a post-it note informing you that what's been redacted is the name of a patient.
Yes.
And the inference that you have drawn from this document, seeing the date, 14th of April 1983, and knowing, as you now know, that there is evidence, indeed, in evidence the inquiry has heard this week about a report of, in May 1983, being made public of a haemophiliac dying of AIDS in Cardiff, reported in May 1983. Your concern and belief is that this is a record made in 1983 that Paul had had the same batch as the patient who died.
Absolutely. It's, apart from blanking the name out, it's quite clear that that's what happened.
And you're concerned that someone has thought it sufficiently significant to record in April 1983 that Paul had had the same batch as another named person, but no one told you or your wife or Paul of the significance of that fact.
No.
Can we go back to 006, please? The last big paragraph describing the examination of the blood reveals a low platelet count.
Yes.
And a low white cell count.
And an intention from Professor Bloom to keep an eye on it.
Go back to the paragraph above that. It looks as though, this is Professor Bloom, is it?
In September 1984, this is Professor Bloom, sir.
Was examining him for symptoms which might be indicative of AIDS.
Yes. Without that, as I understand the evidence, having been communicated in any sense to Paul or his family.
So this document would tend to support the inference which Tony draws from the letter of 007.
The record at 007,
The record at
yes.
007.
Yes. The letter, sir, is 1984, so it's a year further on, but absolutely, yes.
But it shows that whoever was examining Paul at the time had in mind that he might well be suffering from AIDS.
So that is indeed a legitimate inference.
Thank you.
Tony, we're just going to look at a couple of other documents from around the mid-1980s, which I know you're familiar with now. 2406010, sorry, 2406010, extract from the clinical notes. We can see the date there, the 12th of September 1985, and if we go down to the bottom of the page, we can see there the last line, check HTLV3, and then on the right-hand side, we've got LFTs, liver function tests, HTLV3, HB platelets. So that's September 1985, and a note's being made in Paul's records that there's going to be a check of HTLV3, test for that. Was that communicated to Paul at the time?
Well, no, it wasn't. And it's only when I saw these documents in September did I understand that HTLV3 was the code for HIV at the time.
Yes.
It's not used now, it's HIV is used, but I would have been totally confused by it if I'd read it then and think, what is it, what's it all about? And now I realise it was HIV they were talking about.
But the fact that that test was being arranged in September 1985 was not shared with Paul.
No.
And we then see a series of letters starting at 2406008, please. So this is a letter of the 23rd of September 1985. It's from Professor Bloom. It's to the GP. It refers to reviewing Paul in the clinic this week. And then in the last paragraph, it says this. I am pleased to say that the liver function tests, which were grossly abnormal last year, have now reverted to normal, so that presumably his attack of hepatitis has cleared up. Just pausing there. As far as you're aware, was Paul informed that his liver function tests were grossly abnormal and that he'd had an attack of hepatitis?
Didn't know anything about liver function tests at all there for him. My disappointment, I read that I realised there's a professional code of conduct, but our GP had been our GP ever since they were small, and I would have thought he could have possibly talked to us about it at that time and told us what the worry and concern was. But there was still nothing coming through from either side.
We then have reference to various haematological findings, and then this sentence. Unfortunately, his tests for HTLV3 antibody came out as positive, and I will clearly have to keep a close eye on him. There is no current evidence that he has the immune deficiency syndrome, and I do not think that there is the slightest need to label him as such, but nevertheless I shall keep a close eye on him and review him from time to time. I will also counsel him regarding his mode of life, etc. Can I suggest that this information be maintained in the strictest confidence? So Professor Bloom, September 85, wrote to the family GP, Paul's GP, informing him that Paul's tests for HDLV3 were positive.
Yes.
Was that information shared with Paul?
No, Paula knew nothing of that. And in fact, I have no recollection of Paul having any conversations with Dr. Thomas about this situation or any counselling.
And just in relation to the reference to counselling him regarding his mode of life, Monica, you've got a recollection of something Paul said to you. You hadn't met Paul at this stage. We'll
Right.
talk about that in a little while. But Paul told you about questions he was being asked at the haemophilia centre.
Yes, when he would go for his monthly checkups to have, his blood drawn and his weight, then they started asking if he wanted condoms. And I remember him saying to me, I have no idea why they would be asking me that. Out of the blue, that wasn't the norm.
Now, if we then have up on screen, please, 2406009. This is another entry from the medical records, and the purpose of this entry is just to help us date another document, but we can see here it's an entry for the 24th of September 1985, and about 8 or 9 lines down, it refers to Paul going away to Corfu on holiday on Monday. So September 85, Paul's about to go off to Corfu. And if we then have, please, 2406011. This is undated in the records, but it's referring to an injury that Paul sustained. I think it was paragliding in Corfu.
You went paragliding. There was no point in telling him not to do it. Paul had to try everything. But when he came back, he really was in absolute agony and had to be taken straight to hospital.
And we can see it says, it refers to bleeding into the right thigh, parachute harness whilst paragliding in Corfu, and then these words, HTLV3 positive. Now that reference to Corfu tells us that this is probably October 1985. It's just after he's come back from holiday and he's gone to seek treatment. Again, in October 1985, when he's seeking treatment for this, was Paul told then that he was HTLV3 positive?
No.
Can we then have up on screen, please, 2406013? This is a letter dated the 18th of September 1986. It's from Professor Bloom's clinical assistant, Dr. Greeharry, and it's addressed to Plymouth. And Paul was about to move to Plymouth, wasn't he?
Yes, he was starting a degree course in Plymouth.
In architecture.
Yes.
And so his haemophilia care was going to need to be transferred, in part at least, to Plymouth, at least.
All his documentation went to Plymouth.
And so we can see that it's addressed to a doctor in the haematology department at Plymouth General Hospital. I'm writing to introduce the above-named haemophiliac who will shortly be coming to reside in Plymouth, and then there is set out some history in relation to bleeds and factor 8 treatment. And then if we go to the top of the second page of the letter, please, we see it says this. Paul has always responded reasonably well to conventional treatment. He has no inhibitors to factor 8. He is hepatitis B, S antigen negative, hepatitis B, C antibody positive. He is HTLV3 antibody positive, but he's not so far suffered from any symptoms of AIDS-related complex. And then there are references to clinical examination and to a low platelet count from 1982 and going up and down since. So we have here Professor Bloom's assistant writing to Plymouth, telling Plymouth that Paul was HTLV3 positive.
Yes.
Was Paul told at this stage by Professor Bloom or his team?
He went to hospital in Plymouth to have a checkup and met the doctor, and the doctor asked him how he was handling his HIV, and that was the first Paul had heard of it.
That's how Paul discovered that he was
discovered.
HTLV3
Yes.
HIV positive. And we can see that when we look at 2406014. This is a letter dated the 26th of November 1986 from Dr. Prentice, the haematologist in Plymouth, and he says this young man came to my clinic this morning having presented at the weekend with a necrotic bleeding tip of his right middle finger. We stopped the bleeding and cleared up the infection. He was apparently unaware that he was HTLV3 antibody positive, so I've told him this morning and given him some basic counselling. And then the doctor says this, I wonder if he is correct in this statement. So that's
the
how
first
Paul learned.
any of us knew that this, and Paul knew, and we knew. Paul phoned me and he said, I've got a problem. And from that point onwards, life changed.
Now we'll just look at two more letters, Tony.
Right.
2406-015. This is Professor Bloom's response to Dr. Prentice. It's dated the 1st of December 1986. And Dr. Prentice, having queried whether it can have been correct that Paul was unaware of his HTLV3 status, this is the answer. Many thanks for your letter about this boy. I've asked my senior registrar to look out for his notes, send you further details, etc. Of course, the young man has been counselled extensively, and I've also advised him in some detail about sexual practices, etc.
I would challenge extensively. Paul might have had a brief discussion with him on sexual practices, and from what Paul told me, he had no idea why he was being told that at the time, why he should do that, because nobody had told him that he was HIV, and it had never occurred to him that this is what they were talking about.
And what this letter from Professor Bloom back to Dr. Prentice doesn't say is, well, of course he knew he was HTLV3 positive. I informed him myself on such and such a date.
No. I have to say, totally untrue.
And then we have 2406-016. It's just to complete the exchange of correspondence, 12th of January 1987. Here there is a letter from Dr. Prentice saying that he's HIV antibody negative. And I think, Tony, Monica, you have a recollection of when Paul was being tested in Plymouth, that there was some ambiguity about test results. He was told it was positive, then told it was negative, and then finally it was confirmed to him, Monica, that it was indeed positive.
Correct.
Tony, you've recalled in your statement Paul, having been given his diagnosis finally when he was studying in Plymouth, tried to make light of the situation and just get on with his life. Yeah. The two of you went shopping the day he told you.
We stood in the car park, sort of, what do we do now? Paul's reaction was, I could do with a couple of new pairs of jeans, and I wouldn't mind a steak before you go back to Cardiff. So that's what we did. We went out and bought 2 new pairs of jeans, discussed, not in detail, what was happening, because Paul's focus was totally on, I want to get on with this course. And he said, having had a steak, that's really highlighted the fact he wanted to stay and get on with it. His ambition was to become an architect, and nothing was going to take that away from him. He was obviously visibly shaken by it, but he's quite a strong character, and he simply got on with it.
Paul, can we have that first photo back on the screen? To 25600006. Let me just turn it round, please. Thank you. And Monica, you met Paul in September of 1986.
Correct.
In Plymouth, where you were an exchange student.
Yes.
And you, well, what was your impression of Paul? What was he like as a young man?
Well, I was the School of Architecture on the top 2 floors housed international students, so I was there, and he was late deciding whether he was going to come to Plymouth or Manchester, so he got in there. And I remember being up in the communal room, the TV and loads of couches and things, and he came in and he was 6'4" and very handsome. I thought, wow, who's that guy? Thinking he wouldn't be looking at me. And I got to know him pretty much on that first day, and the phone for the students was on my floor, and I felt like I was the only one that could hear it ring, so I'd be legging it down, answering it. And I think one of the first calls I took was either Pat or Tony looking for Paul, and I had to try to find him, and there he was down in the kitchen. So I knew him from really my first day there. He enjoyed a lot of American things, you know, when we made brownies in the kitchen, and, you know, he was interested in those type of treats. And I even had a baseball sent over for him once, because I think he had a glove sent from Philadelphia from his aunt, but no baseball, so.
And you started going out in about May of 1987.
Yes, he had a girlfriend before. And then we saw a lot of each other in functions and things, and then, yes, we did. Picnics, and the weather was nice, and so we went over, did little day trips. He had a car, which was a big deal, so we could, you know, venture out a little bit, and it was nice.
And then in July of that year, 1987, you left the UK to go back to the States.
Yeah, I went over to Ireland. My parents were traveling over there, and we had family. And I sent postcards, but I was very careful what I wrote because I didn't know who was going to read it. And I remember keeping a pound coin so I could call him. And he was walking the dog. And I could hold the phone so it wouldn't lose the amount of money, and I'd call back, and Bethan's like, no, he's still walking the dog. And I'm like, jeepers. So I did get to speak to him before I left the state, you know, fly back to the States.
But you stayed in touch, and he visited you in March 1988 in Boston.
Yes, we stayed in touch by letter. There was no email then. I had a few high phone bills my father was a little dismayed at. And he flew to Chicago. Their course always did a field trip, and it was Chicago that year. And then he arranged to come to Boston, and I had family there. So I borrowed a friend's car, drove up to Boston, and we stayed with my cousin. And I tell people, as romantic as it was that here's this, you know, man that I hadn't seen for so many months, only communicating by letter, my cousin shared a flat with 3 other girls, and the cat had just given birth to kittens. So we're sleeping on the living room floor with kittens crawling all over us, and Paul wasn't a cat person. But we had fun anyway, but that wasn't, you know, as far as from being super romantic.
And then in August of 1988, he came to see you again.
He did. I came in between that one other time because I missed him so much that I wanted, well, no, I correct myself. He did come in that August for 3 weeks. I was very excited. And this was a big thing because I didn't have boyfriends, so my whole family were, you know, wondering who's coming, what this is all going to be about. And he stayed for 3 weeks, but the sole purpose was to tell me that he was HIV positive.
And you said in your witness statement, you can still clearly hear and feel how his words changed my life from that moment and have continued to do so to present. I was absolutely devastated that my handsome, kind, gentle, talented man had become infected with this horrible virus. But your relationship continued and strengthened, and you came over to the UK.
Yes.
And you finally returned to make a home in the UK with Paul in the middle of 1989.
Yes, I came over in the June and stayed after he graduated. And he finally found a job. We had a summer of kind of searching for jobs and things. And then he found a job over in Bristol, and he commuted. During the week, he kind of rented a room from a friend, and I stayed with Pat and Tony. And then he'd come back, and Tony would pick him up at Cardiff, or Bristol, actually, on your way back from Swindon, and then have the weekend, and then he'd have to go back off on the Sunday.
And Paul had graduated with first-class honours.
He did.
in architecture and set about establishing himself with a career in architecture. And you got married in November 1989 in the UK in a civil wedding ceremony.
We did, yes.
And then there was a ceremony you were trying to arrange in the States, but you had a concern about how the HIV status might impact upon that.
Right, so our church wedding was always for the 20th of April in 1990, but at the time, Connecticut law required a blood test, and that was to see for STDs or if for some reason blood would, from either party would have an effect on future children. And naturally, I was concerned, would they be testing for HIV? So at that point, I confided in my best friend, can you find this out for me? So we had to be in America a week before our wedding, and we did the test and everything, and fortunately they did not require, that, so that part was okay. But a lot of that time, which should be just total euphoria, was very stressful.
And Paul kept his HIV status private?
Very. My parents knew that he was a hemophiliac, apart from my best friend, because I needed to confide in her. That is all my family knew.
Now, how was Paul's health over the years that followed your marriage?
I would say for the most part, okay. Naturally, there would be an occasional bleed in the knee. Nosebleeds, I would say, were the worst. He suffered from hay fever, and he would just have his head hanging over this, sitting on the edge of the bath, and just his head hanging over the sink with the water kind of dripping, and his nose would just drip, drip, hours through the night. I would, offer suggestions, not always well received. After several hours, he'd be frustrated. I'd say, let's go to the Heath. He always knew if he got in there, he wasn't getting out right away. So he would try to do everything he knew to prevent it, or to stop it, actually. Sometimes it worked. Couple hospital visits with chest things. Those were always the worst, in the sense of when someone gets a cold and you know that their immune system is lower, I basically describe my life as being on constant high alert, extremely vigilant, but not letting anybody else know that. So no one else that would know me and would know our situation would realize that's how I was. You're constantly making sure things are disinfected and tidied, and if he had a bleed, making sure that was super clean for anyone else that may have come into our home, looking for the best foods, making sure if he was tired, I was always looking for anything to ease any discomfort that he may have been experiencing.
When did Paul discover that his liver had been affected?
We were in Bristol. We had a flat there after we got married in 90. He'd gone up there, so the early 90s, he'd gone up for a checkup, and he came back and he just said, this is what I was told, I have cirrhosis of the liver. And again, you're kind of taken aback. What does that mean? What is involved in that? And then it started on the course of different doctors. Nothing was ever said in the sense of urgency, which I took to mean that they weren't overly concerned, and whether that was just kind of what I wanted to hear. We did go to London, liver specialist there. They mentioned transplant, but it was kind of something like that would be way in the future. We don't need to be worrying about that now. which in fact turned out to not be way in the future. But
And do you know when he was informed that he had been infected with hepatitis C?
no, I don't have that.
So it was the cirrhosis of the liver, the damage to the liver, that was the first he knew.
Yes,
Paul didn't let any of this stop him from getting on with his life.
correct.
We'll put up on the screen another photo, please, Paul. It's 2560005. We'll keep this up on the screen now. That's you, and that's Paul, and that's your daughter.
Correct, yes. She's about 3 there.
And you hadn't been able to have children yourselves, and so you adopted.
We did, yes. We were unique in that respect. I do know that there was another haemophiliac couple that were successful, and we felt encouraged by that. Again, we had to fill out many forms, as any adopted couple would, and then lots of questions. And then we had to open up our personal life to a stranger. And as we kind of passed each hurdle successfully, in the end, they wanted to meet us, a 12-panel committee, I guess, and our social worker was very anxious for us because she said this has never happened. Somehow we were okay. I don't know, but we did it, and we were prepared. And really, the only thing they were asking us is, why did you choose this age group, kind of 0 to 3, and we explained that. So it wasn't anything about Paul's health. We were fine. I think at the end, our social worker we had to kind of carry her out because she was so nervous for us. And we had 2 failed attempts. They had selected us to be matched with a child, and they would talk about it as, so when so-and-so comes, and where's the room, and, as they were almost coming in the next day. And each time, for different reasons, it wasn't successful. And we were pretty wiped out by that. But there was something in me that I knew we were going to have a girl. And the social worker came to our house and, wanted to speak to us, and Paul was running late. And she was like, where is he? Where is he? And that's when she told us about our daughter, and that it would be pretty much straightforward because her birth mother was very young, had been given several opportunities to kind of collect her life and do the things that she needed to. And unfortunately, she wasn't able to do those things. So they said, this will be easy and done. And that wasn't the case. It went till December, and we couldn't tell anybody. And Pat and Tony and Beth were on a rugby tour down under.
We went to Dubai, to the Dubai Sevens. Came back, wanted to talk so much about it. And they put some little piece of paper down that on a Christmas surprise present. And on each piece of paper we had was a child's name. Well, I didn't know it was a child's name at the time. We were trying to make up what these initials stood for.
We were saying that for Christmas, because they just went on holiday, that let's pick a name, and then that's who you buy for. And we wrote our daughter's name on each piece of paper. So then when they looked at it, and then we told them what it was, then that was tears and happiness. So we were allowed to bring her home on the usually they don't allow that because of the time of the year, but she was only 15 months, so we were able to do that. And actually, we couldn't even buy a crib or a pushchair or anything for her in case something happened at the 11th hour. And a very dear family friend said, here's a crib that my daughter never slept in. And Paul had a bleed on his thigh. Do you remember? So we're up in the room, Pat, Beth, Tony, myself, and Paul, and he's got his legs strapped, and he's saying, "Put that in here, tighten it," because he couldn't do it at all, and we were all flummoxed, and we managed to get the crib together, though, so. But again, he was worried that they wouldn't let the baby come home to us if they saw he had a bleed.
But Paul had had, since late 2001, when you'd been, I think, in the States, he'd had the first of a number of episodes of passing out.
Yes.
What happened on that occasion when you were in America?
Okay, so that was pre our daughter. He'd been working in London, very, very long hours, probably drinking Coke and eating candy bars instead of a lunch. We flew to the States to surprise my family. It was the 23rd December. We went for some last-minute Christmas shopping. We were in a record store, and I hear my younger sister screaming my name, and I went legging it back, and he told us after that the CDs seemed to be jumping out at him. He fell forward, passed out, and basically passed out. He had 2 huge black eyes, broken nose, fractured jaw, and he was shaking on the ground. It looked like he was having a seizure. No idea. He had never done anything like that before. The EMTs came. There was a medical kind of small hospital right near the mall, and he was brought right in there. I've had many frightening moments with him, but that was extremely frightening because he wasn't recognizing me. My parents came. I mean, I had to take the pictures for the insurance company after, but it looked like someone literally had taken a baseball bat to his face. It was that bad.
And he had, after that, a number of episodes of passing out.
He did. And it was where one in Cardiff when we had come back from the States, where he was walking around. Fortunately, this time he could feel it coming on, so he managed to sit down and then kind of call me to say, hey, this is what happened. We never really knew if it was a sugar level type thing, so we started carrying glucose tablets in my handbag, in the car, in his work bag. Certain stores, he decided that maybe it was the fluorescent lighting that was affecting him. He was still working in London, and I was always fearful that something would happen there. And our routine would be that he'd call me when he was, because we had cell phone then, when he was leaving work, and I roughly knew that it would take him so much time from office, the train, and then to walk. He was staying with a friend to get to that flat, and I even allowed extra time. And I remember one time he didn't call me. I can only imagine, I equate it to what someone who needed drugs and was looking for a fix. I was hitting that redial button so many times. I was working myself up, like, where could he be? What's happened? He's passed out, someone's stepping over him, no one's going to help him. You know, it was just awful. And then, of course, when he finally answered, I wanted to kill him. Because I was like, where have you been? And he's like, Mons, the train was late or whatever, but he couldn't communicate that to me. Moments like that, very stressful. I realize obviously it's not intentional, but not knowing was very difficult.
And you've described in your statement these episodes. From Paul's perspective, he'd have difficulty speaking, forming words. He would sweat and experience heart palpitations. He said it was like being paralyzed during that episode.
Yeah, so for those, then they had him on beta blockers, and he would be talking to you, and all of a sudden you could see there would be fear, perspiration above his upper lip, his forehead, and he was frozen, so he could not speak. And sometimes, I know it happened one time in a meeting, and he was beside himself. And it wasn't just a case of kind of going out of the room, shaking it off, and going back in, because he didn't know exactly what was happening. On 2 separate occasions, we were working in Cardiff, we were walking down Queen Street, heading to our car, And all of a sudden, I could tell it was happening. I was able to get to our car, got him in, and I was heading to the Heath, and he was saying, like, Moms, where are we going? And I said, we need to go to the Heath because we need to have you checked out. And he's saying, is it because I've been bad? And that's not something that he would say. I said, oh, no, we just need to get this taken care of. And I was, saying my prayers, please let me get there safely and calmly. As we got there, he was kind of coming out of it, and he's like, we're not going through the A&E. I know the back way up to the ward, so that's what we did. So he wanted to avoid that, and they kind of talked to him, gave him, some water and stuff, and then made sure that he wasn't on those again. But another time he did manage to call me, and he was on the bus, and he was afraid. And I was saying to him, can you get off it somewhere? So he could make a sound. So I knew. I got in the car, flew through the lanes, and basically picked him up down in Culverhouse Cross. And he was very frightened.
And you've recorded an observation he made to you on one occasion where he said, Mons, I'm the one with the question mark over my head.
Yes. I always say up until probably the last year that the HIV and the hemophilia certainly were a part of our life, but they weren't our life. We had to deal with those things, but sometimes we had those moments of reprieve where they weren't front and center. And that was probably one of the few times that he really talked about the fact that the unknown.
Paul had been receiving medication for HIV, a range of different medications for a number of years.
Yes.
But he also was prescribed interferon for his hepatitis C.
Yes.
What can you recall about that course of treatment and its effect on him?
Initially, they suggested to take 4 to 6 weeks off from work. The practice that he was at was pretty good about that. I honestly can't remember what, I'm going to have to use the word story we told, but something that was factual, but not maybe the complete story. And he did great. I was coming home, he had cooked something, the yard was tidy, and I was like, okay. And then he went back to work, and then that's really when all the side effects kicked in, and he was cold and achy, and he couldn't sleep, and it was just very difficult, but he had to go into work. So he did every day.
And you've described in your statement he had trouble sleeping, he was run down, but he ended up just battling through it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, in 2008, Paul had an assessment at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, Birmingham, in relation to a liver transplant.
Correct.
How had it come about that, or how was he informed that his liver had deteriorated to the extent that he needed to be placed on the transplant list?
So we, our first holiday with our daughter, we couldn't leave. She didn't have a passport, so we went to Jersey because we can go on the ferry. And we had a nice holiday on the beach, and this particular beach, you had to walk up a large flight of steps, and the car park was up top. So I had tons of stuff, and Paul was holding our daughter, and he got to the top, and she was a solid little girl, but and he got to the top, and it was more than out of breath. And me being me, and I knew something wasn't right, so we finished our holiday. He made a point of going into the center, and telling the doctors what had happened, and they said, okay, we're going to set up a series of tests. And one of them was to inject a dye in, and the idea was to see what was going on, obviously, in his lungs and things like that. And I remember he said, the technician said to him, these things are never positive, don't worry about it. And when he came home, he was lying on our couch, kind of telling me the story, and he said the guy's face just dropped because the dye indicated that there were some severe problems there. And that's when Dr. Dasani and Dr. Collins became, I mean, they were always involved in Paul's health care, but now we saw a liver specialist in Cardiff, then in London, and then we were recommended up to a clinic at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and had to be decided, one, to be on a waiting list just to be on the assessment. And it was a huge process.
The assessment was carried out, and
Yes.
Paul was placed on the waiting list for a liver transplant.
Correct.
And you've said in your statement from that point onwards, anything approaching normality that you had in your life ceased to exist. You spent your life waiting for the phone call.
We did. So Paul was still working. Everything with our daughter and our activities continued, but we were heightened because anywhere we went that was somewhere different, we were making sure we had signal on our phone, that our phones were charged, because the call literally could come at any time. And we already had like a bag packed ready to go. Obviously, Pat and Tony knew that if we called them, they may have to come and get our daughter, or she would come with us, and then they would follow up, to care for her. So it was very stressful.
And you had a couple of calls in which you packed up, drove to Birmingham in the middle of the night, but you were told the liver wasn't right.
Correct, twice.
But then the third call came on the 8th of December 2008, and you packed everything up. And you've said in your statement, you remember thinking that this was the surgery that was going to help you get your lives back.
I did.
Can you tell us what happened after that?
So we got up there. Our daughter was with us, her pink bathrobe. Pat and Tony were on their way, and we were kind of brought, Paul and I and our daughter were brought into, it was like a little family room. Excuse me. And we talked a little bit, and she liked to do group hugs. So we did a group hug, talked a little bit, but it was late. It's probably after 10. So she toddled off with you guys and stayed. Because the assessment had been done, obviously he was successful, I stayed with him that night, just sat in the chair next to him, and not really talked because they were coming in and out to blood pressure and, those kinds of things. Gave me his watch, wedding rings, to hold. And the social worker, came to see us in early, hours as it were. And as, Paul was being led down to the operating room with the surgeon team, I was able to follow down. And I remember being just in that room before they took him in, and I quickly kissed him. I said, "I love you." And then, he was whisked away. And I didn't sigh. I was like, okay, now the people that know what they're doing are in charge, and, this is going to be a way we're going to get our life back. Although we were under no illusion that after the transplant, what would be involved, because they were very descriptive about that in the assessment. 45 minutes later, the social worker came looking for me, saying the surgeon has not started the operation because they feel that the portal pulmonary hypertension that Paul suffered from, that they initially diagnosed as mild to moderate, was now severe, and they didn't feel that his own body would be able to bring him out if they didn't operate, and if they did operate, really the same result, would he live through it. My first thought was, please do not make me make that decision. I was, very frightened. I was frightened because I could think, what if I didn't see him again? They made Paul had a split liver. So the other half went to save a child's life, which was successful, I found out later. They did do it. We waited a very long time. Paul's boyhood friend, James, came up on a train to be with us. And we just waited and waited and waited, and he did come through. And when we went in, they had explained too that when someone has a liver transplant, when they come out of it, they are kind of disorientated. They seem almost like they're a little, I don't say drunk, but they're not sure of things. And then it quickly, as the liver's kind of getting used to the body. Well, he wasn't coming round. He wasn't coming round. His blood pressure was very high. It did go down if I held his hand, and I was allowed to be in there and talk to him. And he did eventually come around, and they did take the tube out. He recognized me. He said hi. They asked him some questions, and they accepted that when he nodded yes or shook his head no, that he was compass and understood where he was and what was going on. And he lived for about a week after. I was staying on the grounds there, and so every 2 hours I was getting an update of his health, through either the nurses or the doctor on call. So on the 15th of December, the on-call doctor said, "Oh, Mrs. Summers, your husband is extremely ill. He has pneumonia," and he started listing all these things, and I was beside myself because I thought, I know he's taking some time to come around, and I wasn't allowed to always be in the room, so I was back in my room, as it were, and my cell phone rang, and the nurse said, "Paul isn't doing well, you need to get over here." I ran pretty fast, climbed a lot of stairs, 2 at a time, and the nurse and the doctor met me, and they just said, "He's deteriorating, and we're going to try a couple things." And I said, they said, "You can go in and see him." And I said, "Well, he's going to wonder what I'm doing here at 1 a.m. He'll be worried something's wrong." And they said, "Oh no, he already knows." So I went in. He had the oxygen mask on. Earlier that day, I had taken a picture of our daughter with a Santa hat on that lit up. And I asked him if he wanted to see it. He said no. He had some pictures of her that he could see from his bedside. And they wanted to tube him again. And he shook his head no. And I said to him, "We've been through bumpy patches. We're going to have to do this." I hugged him, obviously. I had to leave the room. I then did call for a priest. Paul wasn't Catholic, but he was cool with that. He did have the last rites. My sister-in-law was in Birmingham staying with family, so she came. My in-laws were in Wales, and a family friend very kindly drove them at top speed up. I think Beth was with me in the room when they came out, and they basically said, "We have shocked his heart 20 times, and although it would come down into normal rhythm, it could not maintain it, and there wasn't anything else they could do."
And the 4 of you, the 3 of you here and Paul's mum were around Paul's bed when he died early in the morning on the 16th of December 2008.
Yes.
And you had never talked with him about what you described in your statement as the what if, because when he went into hospital for the transplant, you weren't expecting things to be easy, but you were expecting him to come out.
Absolutely. When we, the next morning, when the surgeon, thank you, Tony, when the surgeon who had operated on him came in and was surprised that his patient had passed, I answer people when they say to me, "Oh, Monica, you must have known how ill he was." Well, I certainly knew that he wasn't a well man, but I wasn't expecting that. So if the surgeon didn't realize, then I kind of felt that was okay that I didn't. And at no point in the counseling that we did receive, and they were very, they didn't pull any punches at the Queen Elizabeth. They explained, what that medication could do and how you would feel. And so they were making everyone fully aware that if you are chosen, this is what you can expect initially. And it wasn't that we were naive. I mean, there was one time when we were waiting to hear, and Paul did have a lot of trouble sleeping, so it wasn't uncommon to find him on the couch and the TV on. I went down into our extension that he'd built, and he was crying. And he said, "I'm so afraid I won't watch our daughter grow up." Really, that was the first kind of time he showed anything of fear through all our marriage, really. He didn't ever blame anybody for being HIV or Hep C, because that wasn't his focus. His focus was to live life. He would say to me, "Whatever our daughter's in, we got to be involved in that too, And I do long for having more conversations like that.
And in that period of time between Paul going down for the transplant surgery and Paul's death, although you'd been able to communicate with him through him shaking his head or nodding his head to answer questions, the only and the last word he spoke was that hi to you after he came round from the
Correct.
surgery.
Yes. Yeah.
You had to tell your daughter, who then was 5, that her daddy wasn't coming home.
I did, yeah. It was up in our bedroom. I put her on our bed. I knelt in front of her. I'm going to say one thing before that prior. I did, when we were up at the hospital, Paul was asleep, and he had his mask on, and I did have her come in. It was, the curtains were up, and I wanted her to see him, and it wasn't a frightening setting. I would never, do that. And Tony held her, and she saw him, and I felt that was important. I guess for me, I'm thinking there's always going to be that later in life. So when she was sitting on the bed and I was kneeling in front of her, and I just said, Daddy's heart, it's pumping, and it stopped, and he won't be coming home. She became physically sick. Naturally, she was upset. She cried. She slept with me that night, and she was sick again the next morning. She did see him. I know it's not traditional here for wakes and things, but my brother and my best friend and my mother were flying over, and the funeral home allowed it that we could see Paul anytime that we wanted, and I did, but they would not embalm his body because of everything that he'd been through. Anyone that knows Paul, there was a couple things. He liked to dress smartly. He always had his hair look quite well. And apart from 2 little marks, because the oxygen mask was so tight in his forehead, he looked perfect, and his body was okay. I was worried. But our daughter was able to see him then, and she put some drawings in his casket as well.
You've described in your statement the days and weeks and months that followed being almost more than you could bear.
Yes, found an old diary that I had started after he died saying, I just want to physically step out of my skin. The physical pain of trying to comprehend one life without him and the enormity of my responsibility now for our daughter. Just realizing, when you're looking at pictures and you've been on holiday together and oh, that's Italy, but, where or what time, I'm not able to turn to anybody else and say, hey, remind me of when we did this, or wasn't that funny, I realize I'm not necessarily unique in that, but there's a lot of memories there that sometimes I think I better start writing in the back of those so that I can remember when I get older, or to share with my daughter.
You and your daughter ended up moving back to the States.
We did.
And again, you say in your statement, you've had to make all the big decisions now for her and for yourself without Paul on your own.
Yes. I mean, had it not been for Paul's health issues, we would have lived in the States. He loved it, all the aspects of it. And yes, moving back, I did my research about what I would and wouldn't be allowed to do. I was able to have the widow's pension allowance as far as help, and the trust was allowing me to still continue to have a payment monthly. And I made sure that what we chose, we would be able to do. And my plan was that once I lived there for about a year and got everybody settled in school, that I would look for a job. And unfortunately, that didn't transpire as the way I had hoped, just due to restrictions of the trust. Although they never said you couldn't work, they said if you worked, then we would reduce any monies that we give you. And I couldn't do that.
And you've struggled financially since Paul's death. He had been the main breadwinner for your family.
Yes.
And you have found it very difficult to survive on what you're able to earn and what you receive from the McFarlane Trust and now from the Welsh Infected Blood Support Scheme.
Yes, obviously the McFarlane Trust is no longer the Welsh scheme. They have allowed certain funds to the widows, and then that is it. That's not an ongoing. So I do have a job that's full-time, and I'm very blessed to have that. And I have health insurance with that, which is key if you live in the States. But I do have concerns for the future.
And what's your experience been in general of your dealings with the McFarlane Trust and now the Welsh Infected Blood Support Scheme?
I would have to say in the beginning, the McFarlane Trust was helpful. I'm going back to, with Paul alive, if we were requesting something that we were allowed to, they used to have a booklet, which was great. You could say, oh, okay, I would be allowed to ask for a washing machine if I was moving into a new home, or they would help with legal payments again if you were buying a home. And then they got rid of that book. As the years went on, things that we were asking for, we had asked for before, became more difficult. I had a lovely social worker who's actually here today, who was very helpful mediating. I was able to claim, say, a school uniform allowance for, which wasn't a lot of money, but still that helped. And one time when I went to claim for it, I was told, oh, we don't do that anymore. But I didn't know that. I had asked for help with eyeglasses, and I don't know if it was for myself or my daughter, because she does wear them, and I was told that no, you should be able to budget that out of the money that you are given a month. And that monthly figure, I can say, was to cover food, any activities for basically the running of the house, and that figure is pretty low.
And you've had a number of difficulties when in your dealings with the McFarlane Trust, in getting information, getting responses to your concerns. You were also told on one occasion when you were going to be interviewed for the purposes of an application, this was after Paul's death, that there was a quota in terms of the number of interviews that could be conducted.
Yes, they had some sum of money that they needed to spend, and then they had hired, am I referring to the right?
I think that's the email that your counsel has shown me.
And they were going to, they wanted to disperse this money fairly, but you would have to, fill out lengthy forms, be interviewed, and then it actually went out to an outside marketing company in the end, that the trust itself was no longer carrying out those interviews. I found that interesting because if this is an organization that was supposed to be looking after funds for people who were infected and hopefully their widows and dependents, that they were using some of that fund to spend on another company taking over. It was an arduous process, but that's really what it was with the trust all the time: form filling, proving yourself. They may give you a grant for something, but then they wanted you to pay for it first and prove that you paid for it with a receipt, and then they would give you the funds.
Monica, I know that you have something you're going to read at the end of the evidence from,
Yes.
and indeed from yourself.
Yes.
Is there anything in particular you would want to tell us before we get to that stage about the life that you and have been leading together without Paul and the effect upon her of not having her father there?
Sure. She was 5 when he passed away. She'll be 16 in October. It's very difficult for her to talk about him without becoming upset. I do my best not to cry. It's not because I don't want to cry, but to try to be able to help her talk about him without being so distraught. We have pictures in our home of, like the one on the screen here, and other things. She has some in her room. We are limited to what we do. I'd like to be able to take her and come here, to see her grandparents and her aunt. Tony doesn't enjoy the best of health, so coming to stateside, though they have done that, is really not something that can really happen in the future. So we're pretty good FaceTiming and stuff. She has some emotional difficulties, anxiety, and I do my best to help her with that and find help for her with that. I think it's the one thing that she wants, and I cannot do it. She says to me sometimes, I can't remember his voice. I have some videos somewhere which I will dig out to find for her, but how do you give somebody the impossible?
Tony, you and Pat and Bethan lost a very much loved son and brother. What, if anything, would you like to tell us about that?
I never thought we'd come to this day. Relieved that we're telling our story. Just across from here, there's a park bench, and there's a memorial on it. And it says to Paul Summers, a talented architect who loved the city. And I think I missed something off it. He loved life and his family as well.
Tony, you've got some experiences of your own in relation to the McFarlane Trust and the Welsh Infected Blood Support Scheme, not directly through, or not only directly through Monica and Paul, but also through works you do as part of campaigning and support activities.
And I never saw myself as a campaigner. In October 1986, when it all fell apart, I just felt that we had to do something. And initially, my focus was how do we meet the finances that Paul's going to need. And the difficulty was that because Paul wanted anonymity in everything, to appeal for support for people like Paul, the more I asked about it, the more I began to realise there were more and more people in this situation. Approaches to MPs for support and guidance, always a smile of sympathy, but nothing ever happened. Publicity they wanted, photograph with Paul, impossible, because of the anonymity. And that went on for 20 years, trying to get some feeling of support. It was almost as though they didn't realise it had happened. Many of them didn't understand that it was even happening and that there were so many people in this country suffering. But when Paul died, I just felt initially, can't do this. But I did. And I joined up with Haemophilia Wales, and I felt that really meant I was able to campaign and more actively carry banners outside Westminster, make a nuisance of myself with MPs. You could almost see the expression on their faces, oh God, is that man again? And he's come to harass us and chase us for... And it wasn't money by this time, it was really justice. Yes, money's an issue for many people. For me, it was never, ever the money. It was, how on earth could this happen? Two questions, why and how? And it's only in, I would say, in the last 2 to 3 years that I've felt that the country understands, the government understands. There's a relief of getting here today. There truly is, and I'm so grateful. I think we've reached the end of the beginning, and I think this is the beginning of the end, hopefully, and that we will eventually, and more than anything else, I want to live long enough to see it.
Monica, we're going to put one final photograph up on the screen.
Okay.
This is Paul and the London Eye.
Correct.
And you've got something you want to read from and from yourself.
Yes, I do. Excuse me, just one moment. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Sir Brian and the inquiry team for selecting me to be here today. I feel very fortunate to have this opportunity to represent Paul, not just as a victim. I'm going to share with you some memories and emotions in the hope you're able to formulate a picture of what type of person Paul was. Over the last 3 weeks, I've spent my commute to and from work thinking solely about this moment and knowing it would be my one chance to speak freely about Paul. Our relationship endured distance and absence. It was based on respect, trust, determination, laughter, and above all, a deep, unyielding love for one another. Paul's first visit to Connecticut to meet my family was in August of '88. Everyone took to him immediately, especially my father, putting him to work assembling a bike rack in 90-degree heat while we all watched from inside the air-conditioned house. From that initial visit, my parents always had the Welsh flag flying whenever we came home. Paul's happiest day was when we were given a photo of our daughter, knowing she would complete our family. He slept with the photo by the side of his bed, so if he woke up, he could look at it in the middle of the night. Our daughter brought an immeasurable amount of joy to Paul's life. He took pleasure in every aspect of being a parent, but his favorite moment was hearing her say "Daddy" for the first time. Paul was courageous, witty, a great dancer, softly spoken. He loved music. He was loyal. He was passionate about his career as an architect. He loved the beach, both here in Wales and the States. He had a great sense of humor, a warm smile. He was a Bluebirds fan and loved watching Wales play rugby. He was known to be fashionably late. He could be stubborn. He was a wonderful father and husband. I'm going to read you a little excerpt from Paul's eulogy, which was given by his former boss, Gareth. Paul, what a guy. Here are just some of the words colleagues, clients, and fellow professionals have written about him. Gentle, friendly, warm-hearted, funny, creative, immensely talented, respected, highly valued, noble, one of life's gentlemen, a fine architect, a credit to his profession, and someone who'd stand by his word. I saw other attributes in Paul. I saw his incredible bravery in his face of debilitating hemophilia and his liver tumor. He did not moan. He did not use it as an excuse. He just got on with life and his work as best he could. He did this so quietly, you often didn't know he was there. I worked next to Paul for 2 years, often engaging him in conversation for quite some time before realizing he was actually on the phone to someone. There was a project that Paul worked on. It's the homeless center in Butte Town, and they had emailed Paul's work practice to say that they would like to put up a plaque in his honor. And it said, "We would like to commemorate the contribution that Paul made to the development by unveiling a plaque as part of the opening ceremony." And this is what the plaque says. Paul Summers, architect. This plaque is in the recognition of the important contribution made by Paul Summers to the planning and realization of the Single Assessment Center, a groundbreaking development. Sadly, Paul passed away before the buildings were completed, but has left a legacy for the city of Cardiff. He will be sadly missed by all those who knew him. I have a few more things, but they are brief. When he passed, his practice sent out an email to fellow architect practices, clients, and anyone who may have had interaction with Paul. And they all responded, and our friend Vicky made a beautiful book, and I've just made a copy of some of the things that people have said. This is someone from the United Welsh Housing Association. He was so good to work with, and the design for Northlands reflected his ability to both listen to what we wanted and produced a very high-quality design. This is from the Housing Strategy section of Cardiff Council. Paul was a very special person. If it wasn't for his input, guidance, and support, this Single Assessment Center would have been abandoned long ago. It was a pleasure to work with him, and he has set an impossibly high standard for partnership working. This is from Swansea Council Education Department. I had the privilege of meeting Paul on a number of occasions whilst he was working on the comprehensive school project in Swansea. Paul was so professional, but above all, a perfect gentleman. He spoke fondly of his family and his beautiful daughter. This is a planning company. Yesterday, we learned that the appeal for the Northlands hostel was granted. Paul had worked alongside us on this project and led the design work. I am deeply saddened that Paul is not here to appreciate the outcome, which reflected his hard work and commitment to the scheme. As you rightly say, the redevelopment of the Northlands will be amongst Paul's many legacies. And this is from a client. I could not say I knew Paul very well. The dealings I had with him were always relaxed, and that I knew I was dealing with someone who knew his business and would stand by his word. Qualities rare in this day and age. Sorry, I have 2 left. This is from a colleague. Paul's dedication, vision, integrity affected me deeply and will act as a constant inspiration, not only to me, but to all the people who knew him personally and inhabit the space he created. I will miss him. His guidance and presence will always remind me to remain firm to my convictions and to never settle for good enough. This is from another architect practice. Although I didn't know Paul personally within the industry, I had heard of his reputation and professionalism. Some of his schemes are well known to us in South Wales, and I am sure will act as a legacy to Paul. And finally, this was a former colleague. We all take different paths in life, but no matter where we go, we take a little of each other everywhere. I am privileged to have worked within your shadow, not only as an architect, but as a man, with greater compassion and character. Frank Lloyd Wright once wrote, "A great architect is not made by the way of the brain, nearly as much as he is made by the way of a cultivated heart. Your warmth, creativity, and passion are evident in all that you have portrayed, a testament to your title as one of the best architects I've ever had the pleasure to work alongside and call a friend. You leave behind your legacy for others to witness and view in awe." I'm just reading what my daughter wrote, and then what Daddy meant to me. Even though Daddy died when I was young, I still have many happy memories about the 2 of us. Some of my favorite memories were going to see Cardiff City Bluebirds, learning how to ride my bike, and going to see Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. These are only a few of the many happy memories I have with Daddy. Though I have so many positive memories of the 2 of us, there are still sad memories. They are all of the times we had to bring him to hospital. As I reflect on the last 10 years since Paul's death, my thoughts, feelings, and emotions are many and varied. I am forever changed as a person for having known him and changed by his death. Although I no longer cry every day, and I am able, most of the time, to talk about him without breaking down, there are times when it still feels unreal to me. This journey of grief and loss has left me physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausted at times. The realization that there are still years ahead before we have the answers we all seek is daunting, to say the least. However, my love and loyalty for Paul and my determination to witness justice outweigh any overwhelming emotions. It is my sincere wish that my statement and the words I have just spoken will leave a lasting impact on Sir Brian and the inquiry team. I would like to thank them again for allowing me this additional time to speak about Paul. I'm going to end with a quote I found on a scrap of paper at my mom's house several months ago. I don't know the author, but the words really resonated with me. "Grief never ends, but it changes. It's a passage, not a place to stay. Grief is not a sign of weakness nor a lack of faith. It's the price of love." Thank you.
No further questions, sir.
I don't have any questions. I would like to say that when your evidence is over, your witness statement will be put out on the web, as is our practice. But anyone who's listened to you today will have realized that you've done exactly what you set out to do, which is to tell us what Paul was really like. And in what you said, I think you've painted not only a compelling picture, but a much more vivid picture than ever comes out of the printed word of what Paul was really like. A picture every bit as vivid as the photographs we have seen, painted with words, and described a person who I think, in Tony's words, loved life and his family. And I'd just like to thank you both for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What do we do now?
We'll take a break until 12:15.
Thank you, sir.
12:15.